Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Historian. Find a comfortable spot. Let the noise of the day fade away, and allow the quiet of the night to settle around you. We're going to travel back in time together, to a world lit by firelight and filled with wonders. Did you know that for a Renaissance noble, a feast was not just about food, but about power, art, and a kind of culinary magic we can barely imagine today? It was a theater of taste, a spectacle of wealth. If you enjoy these late-night journeys into the past, do consider subscribing. It helps our small corner of history continue to grow. Now, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let's travel to the banquet halls of the Renaissance to uncover the surprising, strange, and utterly delightful foods that graced the tables of the powerful. The great halls of Renaissance Europe were more than just dining rooms. They were stages. Upon these stages, the drama of power, prestige, and politics was played out, and the feast was the headline performance. Before a single guest arrived, the air would be thick with anticipation, a hum of activity echoing from the cavernous kitchens. Imagine a long, imposing room, its stone walls softened by immense tapestries depicting heroic hunts or biblical allegories. The ceiling, a dark sky of heavy oak beams, seems to recede into shadow far above. Down below, the room is a sea of flickering light. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of beeswax candles burn in great iron chandeliers and silver candelabras, their collective glow casting a warm, honeyed light that makes jewels glitter and dances across polished silver. The air is cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of stone and beeswax, but it's quickly being infused with the aromas drifting from the kitchens, the promise of roasted meats, exotic spices, and baking bread. Long trestle tables, draped in heavy linens of the purest white, stretch the length of the hall. Each place is set with a personal knife, a spoon, and a trencher, a thick slice of day-old bread that will serve as an absorbent plate. There are no forks yet for most. That is an Italian affectation, slow to catch on. Instead, there are fingers and elaborate silver basins of scented water brought by servants for washing between courses. The sheer scale is breathtaking. This is not a meal for a few. It is a statement for many. It is designed to awe, to overwhelm, to communicate without a single word that the host is a person of immense wealth and sophisticated taste. The preparations have taken weeks, the ingredients sourced from across the known world. And as the guests begin to arrive, their silks and velvets rustling, the performance is about to begin. At the heart of this performance was a form of culinary art that has all but vanished from our world: the sotelt, or subtlety. These were not mere desserts or table centerpieces. They were intricate, edible sculptures, crafted primarily from sugar, marzipan, and pastry. They were the punctuation marks of the feast, presented between courses to inspire wonder and conversation. Imagine a master cook, who in this era was as much an artist, an engineer as a chef, working for days in a dedicated confectionery kitchen. His medium is not clay or marble, but a sugar paste, boiled to the perfect temperature, then pulled, molded, and sculpted with incredible precision. He might be crafting a miniature castle, complete with towers, battlements, and tiny sugar knights standing guard, or perhaps a scene from mythology. Diana at the hunt, with delicate hounds and a silver-bowed goddess, all rendered in shimmering sugar. These creations could be enormous, taking up a significant portion of the high table. They were often brightly colored with natural dyes: saffron for a brilliant gold, sandalwood for red, spinach for green. Sometimes they were gilded with real gold leaf, making them glitter and flash in the candlelight as if they were magical treasures. The sotelt was more than just a pretty object. It was a narrative device. It could carry a political message, perhaps depicting the coat of arms of an honored guest or celebrating a recent military victory. It could be a visual pun or a riddle for the guests to solve. And at the end of the course, after everyone had admired it, this masterpiece of confectionery art was broken apart and eaten. It was the ultimate expression of conspicuous consumption. To create something so beautiful, so costly, and so time-consuming, only to destroy and devour it in a matter of moments. It was a testament to a host's wealth, demonstrating that he could afford to commission and then consume pure art. Now picture the moment of presentation. The course of roasted meats has just been cleared away. There is a lull in the conversation, a moment of quiet anticipation. Then a flourish of trumpets from the musicians' gallery. The great doors to the kitchens swing open, and a procession of servants enters, moving with practiced solemnity. They carry, on a massive silver platter, the sotelt. Let's say tonight it is a depiction of St. George and the dragon. The dragon, sculpted from dark marzipan and glistening with a green glaze, rears up, its mouth open in a silent roar. St. George, in shining sugar armor, sits astride a white horse, his lance poised. The scene is a marvel of detail, from the individual scales on the dragon to the delicate reins on the horse. A collective gasp ripples through the hall. The guests lean forward, their faces illuminated by the candlelight, their eyes wide with wonder. They point and murmur, admiring the artistry, discussing the story it tells. The host, seated at the head of the table, watches their reactions with a satisfied smile. This is the point. This is the return on his investment. The sotelt has done its job. It has created a moment of shared awe, a memory that will be spoken of for weeks to come. It has elevated his feast from a simple meal to an unforgettable event. For a few precious minutes, the sugar sculpture is the center of this universe, a testament to the fleeting, beautiful, and powerful world of the Renaissance court. Then, with ceremonial gravity, the host takes a small hammer and cracks the sculpture, signaling that this work of art can now be enjoyed as a sweet confection. The magic is broken, but the impression remains. But the spectacle did not end with sugar. The main courses themselves were a form of theater, and no creature offered a more dramatic entrance than the peacock. To us, eating a peacock seems strange, perhaps even a little barbaric. But in the Renaissance, it was the height of culinary fashion, a dish that was as much about the visual presentation as it was about the taste, which, by most accounts, was rather dry and tough. The goal was not to create the most delicious dish, but the most astonishing one. The process was a feat of culinary taxidermy. After the bird was killed, the cook would make a careful incision down its back, and with the skill of a surgeon, peel the entire skin away, feathers, head, and tail all intact. This feathered cloak was then carefully preserved, often treated with spices like cumin to keep it fresh. Meanwhile, the peacock's body was roasted. It might be stuffed with a rich mixture of other meats, herbs, and spices, or larded with pork fat to try and add some moisture. Once cooked, the real artistry began. The roasted bird was painstakingly redressed in its own feathered skin. The cook would carefully fit the skin back over the body, sewing it up so the seam was invisible. The neck was propped up with a wooden stick or wire, the head arranged in a lifelike pose, and the magnificent tail fanned out in its full, iridescent glory. Sometimes, the beak and crest would be gilded with gold leaf. A piece of camphor soaked in alcohol might be placed in its beak and lit, so that it appeared to breathe fire as it was brought into the hall. The final presentation was pure drama. Carried aloft on a golden platter by the master cook himself, the peacock would enter the hall looking as if it were still alive, a shimmering jewel of blue and green. It was a resurrection, a culinary miracle. The guests would applaud, marveling at the skill required to present such a creature. It was a symbol of immortality, of beauty, and of the host's power over nature itself. To kill, cook, and then seemingly bring a creature back to life for his own glory. The peacock was the star, but it was by no means the only bird to receive this spectacular treatment. The entire aviary of the medieval and Renaissance world was fair game for the feasting table, and the more dramatic, the better. Swans, with their elegant long necks, were another favorite. Like the peacock, a swan would be roasted and then redressed in its white feathers, its neck often gracefully curved, its beak gilded. It was a symbol of purity and nobility, a dish fit for a king or queen. Herons, cranes, and bustards, large and impressive birds, were also served in their feathers. The goal was always to create a lifelike tableau on the table, a sort of edible diorama of the natural world, tamed and brought indoors for the pleasure of the diners. But it wasn't just about refeathering. Sometimes the birds were incorporated into larger set pieces. A swan might be made to look as if it were swimming on a lake of jelly, surrounded by smaller roasted birds. The sheer variety was a mark of status. A host might boast of serving 24 different types of birds in a single feast, from large game birds like geese and capons down to tiny larks and sparrows, which were often roasted and served dozens at a time on a single platter, each one a tiny, savory mouthful. This obsession with birds speaks to the aristocratic love of hunting. The feast was a way to display the bounty of the Lord's lands and his prowess in the hunt. Serving these wild birds was a direct reflection of his control over his domain. It was a world where the lines between the wild and the civilized, the raw and the cooked, were blurred and celebrated in the most dramatic ways imaginable. A flock of once wild creatures, now tamed by fire and artistry, served up to declare the power of their master. If refeathering a swan wasn't strange enough, Renaissance chefs had an even more bizarre trick up their sleeves. The creation of fantastical hybrid beasts. The most famous of these was the cockentress. This was not a real animal, but a culinary chimera, a monster stitched together in the kitchen. The chef would take the front half of a suckling pig and the back half of a large chicken or capon and carefully sew them together. The pig's half would be stuffed with a forcemeat made from chicken, and the chicken's half would be stuffed with a forcemeat made from pork. The whole creature was then roasted on a spit, basted carefully to ensure both halves cooked through. The final result, when presented at the table, was a creature of myth. It looked like something from a medieval bestiary, a playful and slightly grotesque joke for the diners. Sometimes it would be presented sitting upright, perhaps with a tiny helmet on the pig's head and a miniature lance tucked under the chicken's wing. It was a conversation starter, a piece of culinary theater designed to delight and amuse. It demonstrated the chef's incredible skill, not just in cooking, but in sewing and construction. It also reflected a Renaissance fascination with the marvelous and the monstrous, a love of trickery and illusion. The cockentress was a lie told with food, a delicious deception that blurred the lines between the animal kingdom and the wild imagination of the artist chef. It was a way of saying that in this hall, under this host's patronage, even the laws of nature could be playfully bent for the sake of a good meal and a memorable evening. The element of surprise was a key ingredient in any successful Renaissance feast. The host and his master cook were always looking for ways to shock and delight their guests, to create moments that would be talked about for years. And no dish delivered a bigger shock than the surprise pie. From the outside, it looked like any other enormous pie, or pie, as it was often called. It would have a thick, sturdy pastry crust, known as a coffin, which was designed more as a cooking vessel and container than as something to be eaten. This great pie, perhaps several feet across, would be paraded into the hall and placed before the guest of honor. A special knife would be presented. All eyes would be on the pie as the guest made the first ceremonial cut into the crust. But instead of steam and the scent of cooked meat, something entirely different would emerge. The crust would be lifted away, and suddenly a flurry of wings and a chorus of chirps would fill the air as dozens of live birds, often blackbirds or finches, would fly out from the pie. They would flutter around the rafters of the great hall, a living, breathing surprise that filled the room with motion and sound. The guests would gasp, then laugh and applaud at the cleverness of the trick. The birds were, of course, placed in the pre-baked pie shell just before serving. A few air holes would be discreetly poked in the crust to keep them alive. It was pure, unadulterated entertainment. It was a moment of magic, a release of wildness into the formal, controlled environment of the feast. It's the origin of the nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," with its 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. They weren't baked, of course. They were just temporarily housed. This love of culinary pranks extended to other dishes, too. A chef might make a fake porcupine out of pastry, with slivered almonds for quills, or craft fish that appeared to be meat, and meat that appeared to be fish, to accommodate religious fasting days without sacrificing spectacle. The feast was a game, and the food was the primary player, designed to trick the eye, delight the senses, and always keep the guests guessing. While these visual spectacles were dazzling, the true foundation of Renaissance noble cuisine, the element that truly separated it from the food of the common person, was spice. Today, we think of spices as flavorings used with a delicate hand to enhance a dish. In the Renaissance, spices were wealth. They were status, medicine, and magic, all ground into a fragrant powder. Spices like black pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and ginger traveled thousands of miles over treacherous sea and land routes from the Far East. They passed through countless middlemen, each one adding to the cost. By the time a peppercorn or a clove arrived in London or Florence, it was worth a staggering amount of money. To use spices lavishly was the ultimate display of wealth. It was like sprinkling your food with gold dust, and so they did. Imagine a kitchen in a great house. Not a small, tidy room, but a vast, bustling complex. In a locked storeroom, the clerk of the spice kitchen would preside over chests filled with these fragrant treasures. For a major feast, the quantities required were immense. Records from the 15th century show noble households buying spices by the pound, at a time when a single pound of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. This wasn't just about showing off. The medical theories of the day, based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humors, played a huge role. Every foodstuff was believed to have certain properties: hot, cold, wet, or dry. Spices were generally considered hot and dry, and they were used to balance the properties of other foods. Fish, for example, was cold and wet, so it was almost always served with spices to counteract its nature and make it healthier to digest. The result was a flavor profile almost alien to our modern palates. Dishes were saturated with spice. A single meat dish might contain cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, ginger, and pepper all at once. The flavors were not subtle. They were a full-on assault of aromatic intensity. The color, too, was important. Saffron, the most expensive spice of all, was prized for the brilliant golden yellow hue it imparted to food. A dish of golden chicken was a sign of extreme luxury. The taste of a noble's meal was a taste of the exotic, a taste of distant lands and dangerous journeys. It was a flavor of pure, unadulterated power. The sheer quantity of spice was one thing, but the way it was used is perhaps even more surprising to us. Today, we have a very clear line between our sweet and savory courses. A main course is salty and savory. Dessert is sweet. That distinction simply did not exist in the same way on a Renaissance table. Sugar, the ultimate luxury spice, was used everywhere. It was just as likely to be found in a meat stew as it was in a confection. A dish of venison or rabbit might be heavily seasoned with cloves and pepper, but also sweetened with a large amount of sugar and studded with dried fruits like dates and raisins. This sweet and sour or sweet and spicy profile was incredibly popular. It had its roots in medieval and Arabic cuisine and was considered the height of sophistication. Imagine a sauce for a roasted capon made from ground almonds, chicken broth, wine, and a heady mix of ginger, cloves, and sugar. Or a meat pie where the rich, savory filling was layered with currants, dates, and a generous dusting of cinnamon and sugar. This fusion of flavors meant that a meal did not progress from savory to sweet. Instead, each course would feature a mix of dishes, Some more savory, some more sweet, all served at the same time. A guest might take a bite of spiced rabbit, then a spoonful of a sweet fruit tart, then a piece of salted fish. It was a completely different way of thinking about a meal, a tapestry of tastes where sweet and savory were not opposites, but partners. This is also why those elaborate sugar sotels were served between courses, not just at the end. They were part of this continuous spectrum of flavor, a sweet and artistic interlude in a meal that celebrated the combination of all tastes. One of the most common and versatile dishes on the noble table, which perfectly illustrates this blend of flavors, was blancmange. Now, when we hear that word, we might think of a simple, wobbly milk pudding. The Renaissance version was something else entirely. Its name, meaning white food, was its defining feature. In an era before modern refrigeration, a pure white dish was a symbol of purity, cleanliness, and expense, as it required the most refined and costly ingredients. The base was not typically cow's milk, which was considered peasant food. Instead, it was made with almond milk, created by steeping ground almonds in water or broth. The thickener was rice flour, another expensive import. The key protein was the shredded white meat of a chicken or capon. So, at its heart, this was a dish of chicken, almonds, and rice. To this base, the cook would add a significant amount of sugar and often a delicate touch of rosewater for fragrance. The mixture was cooked down to a thick, creamy porridge, resulting in a dish that was subtly sweet, savory, and nutty all at once. Blancmange was the ultimate chameleon. It could be served as part of any course. It was considered a restorative food, perfect for invalids, but its elegance made it a staple at the most lavish banquets. Chefs would often color it with different natural dyes, pale pink with sandalwood or yellow with saffron, creating a rainbow of blancmanges on the table. Sometimes it was molded into elaborate shapes, just like the sugar sotels. It might be served in a dish topped with fried almonds and a sprinkle of sugar. It perfectly captures the Renaissance palate, a dish we might struggle to categorize as a main course or a dessert, but which they saw as a perfect, harmonious, and incredibly fashionable food. With all this talk of meat, spice, and sugar, you might be wondering, where are the vegetables? For the most part, they were conspicuously absent from the noble table, or at least, they played a very minor role. In the Renaissance mindset, foods were often categorized by how they grew. Foods that grew high up, like birds that flew in the air or fruits that grew on trees, were considered more noble and closer to God. Foods that grew in or on the ground, like root vegetables, were seen as coarse and peasant-like. This was tied to the humoral theory as well. Many vegetables were considered to be cold and wet, and potentially dangerous to the constitution of a refined nobleman. Carrots, parsnips, and onions were food for laborers, things to fill the belly but lacking in prestige. There were exceptions, of course. Salads, or salads, made of fresh greens, herbs, and flowers, became fashionable, especially in Italy. They were often dressed simply with oil and vinegar, but even these were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Asparagus and artichokes, both considered aphrodisiacs, were luxury items that would appear on a wealthy table. But you would not find a simple dish of boiled potatoes or steamed carrots. The emphasis was always on meat, fish, and fowl. The foods of the hunt and the manor. A plate piled high with vegetables would have been seen as a sign of poverty, not of health. It's a stark contrast to our modern dietary advice, a reminder that what we consider good food is always shaped by the culture and science of the time. While old-world vegetables were viewed with some disdain, the age of discovery was beginning to introduce a host of new and exotic plants from the Americas. However, their adoption was incredibly slow and often fraught with suspicion. These new arrivals were curiosities, not staples. Tomatoes, for instance, arrived in Europe from Mesoamerica via the Spanish, but for centuries they were grown mostly as ornamental plants in the gardens of the wealthy. They were part of the nightshade family, and many people believed them to be poisonous. Their Italian name, pomodoro or golden apple, suggests they were initially more yellow than red and were admired for their beauty rather than their taste. It would take until the 18th and 19th centuries for the tomato to become a cornerstone of Italian cuisine. Similarly, the potato, which would later save entire populations from famine, was initially met with deep distrust. It was a humble tuber, a food from the dirt, and it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, which made some people deeply suspicious of it. For a long time, it was considered fit only for animal fodder or as a food for the desperate. A Renaissance noble would have been far more likely to admire a tomato plant in his garden as an exotic novelty than to ever consider eating its fruit. The new foods that were more readily accepted were those that fit into existing categories of luxury, like chocolate and vanilla, which could be incorporated into the existing love for sweet, spiced drinks and confections. The full impact of the Columbian exchange on the European dinner plate would not be truly felt for many, many years to come. To wash all of this down, the drink of choice was wine. Water was often unsafe to drink, and beer was the beverage of the common people. For the nobility, wine was essential. It was drunk at all meals by men, women, and even children, though it was often watered down. But just as with their food, the nobles didn't want simple wine. They wanted it spiced, sweetened, and enhanced. The most popular and prestigious of these spiced wines was Hippocras. Named after the Greek physician Hippocrates, it was considered a healthy and digestive aid. The recipe varied, but it was typically made from a good quality red wine, sweetened with a large amount of sugar or honey, and infused with a potent mixture of spices. Usually cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes grains of paradise or nutmeg. The creation of Hippocras was a careful process. The spices were ground and mixed into the sweetened wine. Then the entire concoction was strained multiple times through a special cloth filter known as a Hippocratic sleeve, which is how it got its name. This process clarified the wine, removing the gritty spice residue and resulting in a smooth, intensely aromatic, and very potent drink. It was like a precursor to modern mulled wine, but served both warm and cold and with a much more intense flavor. Hippocras was often served at the end of the feast, a final, luxurious flourish to settle the stomach after a massive intake of rich food. To serve Hippocras, especially one made with the finest spices, was yet another signal of the host's immense wealth and his concern for the well-being of his guests. As the last course was cleared and the final cups of Hippocras were drained, the great hall would look very different. The pristine white linens would be stained and scattered with crumbs. The air, once filled with music and laughter, would be thick with the lingering scent of roasted meat, spice, and guttering candles. The guests, full to bursting, would be leaning back, their faces flushed from the wine and the heat of the room. The feast was over. It had been a success. The host had displayed his wealth through mountains of spice, his power through the presentation of exotic beasts, and his sophistication through the artistry of his master cook. The guests had been entertained, amazed, and most importantly, impressed. These feasts were more than just gluttony. They were a vital tool of statecraft and social cohesion in a world built on personal relationships and displays of power. An alliance could be sealed over a dish of refeathered swan. A rival could be intimidated by the sheer scale of the sugar sculptures. The memories of these surprising, spectacular dishes would linger long after the meal was over, cementing the host's reputation and his place in the complex social hierarchy of the Renaissance. It was a world where food was a language and every dish was a carefully crafted statement. And so, our journey to the Renaissance banquet hall comes to a close. We leave behind the ghosts of the feast. The faint scent of rosewater and ginger, the echo of lutes, and the shimmering memory of peacocks breathing fire. It was a time when food was not just fuel, but a vibrant and essential part of art, science, and society. a time of strange and wonderful delights. I hope this glimpse into their world has been a peaceful one for you. Thank you for joining me here at the Sleepy Historian. Until next time, sleep well.